友谊的热情、支持和关照，所以就首先要说一声感谢啊。So I'm an American millennial, 千禧一代. I'm an American millennial. There's 80 million of us. Everyone wants to know who we are, what we stand for, who we're going to vote for, what we want to buy, you know. But again, there's only 80 million of us. There are over 400 million Chinese millennials. Young China number one. On the other side, Young China also means an ancient culture re-emerging as a modern nation, re-emerging with a modern identity in today's world.
Okay, Zach, that's great that finally we made it and we can see each other in this new year that is full of tensions. We started already with so many tensions, and in the center of these tensions is also China. You have founded a group that's called Young China Group. Can you explain a little bit what it's about and how do you see this current year in our relations with China?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Stephanie. It's good to see you again. So my organization is called the Young China Group, and it's a market insights organization and a management consulting organization. The goal being bringing a people-first perspective of China to the world and focusing on how that people-first perspective can drive economic and political outcomes. Mexico is really interesting for a variety of reasons, but the part of the reason that we're here is focusing on how China is impacting Mexico. And of course, Mexico is, there's few countries on earth who have closer ties with the United States, even if they're not always happy ties, but through trade, security considerations, and of course, proximity.
Mm-hmm. And did you go to Mexico because of the situation of coronavirus in China, or did you have you been in China when it all happened?
So I was based in China up through January of 2020. And for part of my work, I speak at conferences and summits and that. And so I was in January of 2020, I packed for a 2-week trip to the United States. And on January 23rd, I had a ticket back to Wuhan, China.
Oh.
My book was my book was coming out, and we were filming something with Tencent, the company behind WeChat, one of China's largest tech companies, who of course also has media considerations. And the folks at Tencent were like, "Hey, like maybe delay your flight for like a week," and that was 3 years ago.
Wow.
And so I ended up getting stuck in the United States. I literally only had 2 weeks of clothing. I was in New York for much of it. And actually, just on a personal note, in March of 2020, I ended up going on a date in New York on March 11th of 2020, which was like the last day you were allowed to date. And that woman ended up being my wife. I got married 6 months ago.
How beautiful. Yeah. That's a nice story. But she's American, or she's Chinese?
She's Chinese. She had been in the United States for 8 years. And so both of us sort of, from two relatively opposite cultures and countries, meet in the middle, and we're a very bilingual couple. Depending on who's trying to get the upper hand, we'll fight in one another's languages, but mostly it's not fighting in a lovely romance.
That's funny somehow, because your governments are quite in a not official, but in a technical war somehow, economic war.
Certainly adversarial.
So how do you live that as a couple, and how do you, with your company, how you try to help for a better understanding between the two cultures?
So this is why I keep harping on this idea of a people-first approach to China. Why is that? Normally when people think of China, they think of one of two things. First is big government, which is scary. I know in Europe, this is the version of China that gets talked about a lot. And understandably so, especially these last 3 years where government has taken more center stage of the economy. So that's China number one. China number two, of course, is big economy, which is exciting, but also scary. And what's often missing in people's understanding of China is this people-first approach. And the reason I think that's so important, aside from see a macro economy and look at these financial charts that are coming out of China or Germany or Spain or the United States and think, ooh, that's, you know, that's a person or a place that I'd like to get to know better. But understanding the people who live within that country is what really made me fall in love with the place. You know, I spent my 20s in China not expecting to start an insights firm, not expecting to be, you know, have the opportunity to speak around the world. I just came to love it. And that had to do with people's warmth, that had to do with people's kindness, being invited in to families' homes around the country, to
But that's
talk with their
because
kids
you
and get to
spoke
know
the
their
language.
families.
You spoke the language,
The
no?
language is important,
Yeah.
and you know, for me, it was fundamental. But there's so many. I think of them as bridge people, right? Like I think of the work that I do as bridge work.
But of course, if there's going to be a war over Taiwan or whatever, then it's a government just decides. And do you think that there's a possibility of a change of government coming from the people in China? Like the thing about the coronavirus now, the protests against the measures and then the decision to open up again, that was for me a little bit surprising. Like they had an impact.
So this is the question I'm most often asked. One of the fun parts about being young China oriented is that it's young people who mostly drive political change, and that's been the case for going to happen. Now, the protests that we saw over this last stretch of time, which impacted, you know, which we saw across 79 universities, which is unprecedented in China.
Mm.
And not only that, for every person who is in the streets, I'd say it's about a 20-to-1 ratio of people posting online. It's more invective and harsh criticism publicly towards the government online than I have ever seen. It's a nuance, but it's an important nuance.
What do you think about the role of the United States with regard to Taiwan? The visit of the president of the Congress president. No, it was everyone here
Pelosi.
thought that was
Yeah.
kind of really stupid to do that at that moment. And sometimes we get the impression that United States is provoking conflicts. And I feel also with Germany, they're getting a little bit tired of American policy.
It's an interesting point, and particularly with the European involvement. Obviously, Chancellor Scholz and his visit to China sent a message to the world, as did Pelosi's visit over summer. And so let's take a step back for a second. Yes, Nancy Pelosi's visit to China was both a provocation as well as perceived as a provocation within China. Both are important because if, you know, in the United States, they were saying, oh, Biden didn't have control over Nancy Pelosi. In China, the idea that the president would not have any involvement or the ability to stop such a visit is ludicrous. It just wouldn't, you know, it's not accepted at face value at all. So whether or not it was intended as a provocation, it was certainly perceived as one. On top of that, before the party Congress in October, there was a noticeable shift in posture from the United States towards China, particularly around the issue of semiconductors. The issue of semiconductors is probably the most critical issue over the next 5 or 10 years in terms of economics, politics, and of course, warfare and safety. And pretty much overnight, the United States tried to kneecap and successfully kneecapped the Chinese semiconductor industry. And so overnight, the ability for the United States to support China in terms of componentry, in terms of purchasing, and also in terms of personnel. So I had friends who were working at semiconductor fabs in China who, US citizens, overnight, if they were working at China working at these fabs the next day, they could lose their US citizenship. And so the posture from the United States has palpably changed. It hasn't gotten as much attention as I would expect. But a lot of this has to do with the calculation of, okay, China might be at its weakest right now. You know, if we wait 5 years, the number that we hear from US generals all the time is 2027 in China. In 2027, China will have far more capable amphibious military capabilities in the Asia Pacific. And so taking the opportunity now to try to destabilize the government and veer them off the course of development that they were angling on, and trying to basically contain them to a certain degree, that seems to be the policy shift really since early October. And it's felt within China. It's not written about as much as I would expect. And it certainly does feel like it's provoking a conflict. Now, I have two different hats that I'm wearing here, right? You know, one of the hats is the world that I'd like to see personally.
Yeah.
And of course, I wouldn't like to see conflict. I wouldn't like to see the US necessarily reaching into
There could be a third world war. I mean, that's
very
really
certainly
serious. I'm really a little bit afraid, and I'm wondering if the young Chinese people would support such a conflict.
So before we get there, the other hat that I wear is the strategic hat. And from the US military perspective, it feels like a decision has been made that now is the moment to destabilize or throw China off of its trajectory. And strategically, I don't necessarily think that's wrong. Now, the conflict in Taiwan amongst young people, I don't think in the near term China will invade Taiwan. China's goal is to absorb Taiwan, not to invade it. And particularly
yeah, yeah, okay, but I don't think that Taiwan is going to voluntarily accept being absorbed. No, they will fight back.
Well, it depends. And again, absorption is not military, it's economic. I was in Taiwan in 2015 doing research for Young China. I spent a month there. I interviewed over 100 young people at Taiwan University, as well as traveled throughout the island doing interviews. And the takeaway for me at the time was that people in Taiwan and young people in Taiwan felt what they called an 依靠感. So 依靠means to rely on someone, so a sense of reliance. And that was the sense of reliance on the US. They identify with mainland China, but their economic opportunity felt to be intimately tied with the growth of China. And so the sense of being caught in the middle in this great power relationship within Taiwan was more nuanced than, you know, no matter what, we don't want to be associated with the place. And so absorption is a 20-year plan. It's not a 5-year plan.
I wanted to ask you, because in Russia, we get the idea that most of the Russians supporting Putin's strategy, also because they have not all the information. And the same is a little bit the case for China, no?
Definitely. And maybe even more severe in China, particularly when you get out of Shanghai, get out of Beijing, and are in more second and third tier cities.
So would there be rebellion of these young international people that you have contact with, that have lived outside, and would there be any? Lately, we don't hear about any dissidents, really, any strong resistance leaders, no, in China.
Well, I mean, these protests have been the strongest resistance to leadership in China in the last 30 years. So there is definitely more of that now than there has been in some time. But I think you have to consider the reasons for war and the reasons for absorption the Chinese government is describing to its people. It's far more about historical unification, a historic right to the territory. It's more grounded in at least a version of reality that is based in a version of facts, even if it's not facts that the sort of global, particularly Western European and North American political establishment acknowledge.
Yeah, because I also, that's something I wanted to ask you as well, because from the US, we get all these messages about shootings, a 6-year-old the other day. I mean, about so many drugs invading. Really, you have the impression that half of the Americans are completely drugged with pills, or, I mean, at least that's the message we get. And I have the feeling that China has not such a problem with drugs, or there is a part in the Chinese government that what you said before, they really somehow want the good for the people. I don't know if I'm completely wrong.
I mean, look, there's an answer I would give to you 9 months ago, and there's an answer I would give to you in these last 9 months. 9 months ago, when people in China, particularly during Delta, and before the Shanghai lockdowns, which really turned things left for the perception of the government, people in China would say their system was handling COVID better, pretty well across the board. That the government had taken definitive action to significantly decrease the amount of death and illness in the country. And then came the epic failure of the Shanghai lockdowns and a variety of failures on the back end of that, that made the policies seem illogical, inhumane, overly draconian, and damaging to the public. And so 9 months ago, I would say that most everyone in China would have a preference for their system, because it's not just, when you think about sort of toppling the system, you're not just talking about a distaste or a dislike for your own system, right? It also means that you have something that you want to replace it with. So, like, really an easy example, if I don't like these headphones, I'm not just going to throw them out unless there's a headphone out there that I really know and like. Now, governments are not electronics, but, and I've said this to US senators, the biggest threat to the Chinese Communist Party is a high-functioning, high-minded, enviable US democracy. And I say US specifically because within China, the US is often the country they're most compared to. It's been 30 years of that. But even during the Cultural Revolution, like the slogans were "Chao Ying Gan Mei," surpass England, catch up with America. The United States really was a city on the hill for a lot of people in China, particularly young people as they were growing up. And so the dysfunction of the United States, particularly during the Trump era, that was the easiest moment to point to. But you're right, there's violence at schools. There's a 7-year-old who shot their teacher yesterday, I believe. Gun violence in cities, the homelessness when you arrive in San Francisco, the opioid epidemic.
It's a broken society, and the Chinese society, for me, I have an anarchy friend here in Spain as well. He has a company in China, and you should get in contact with him. He really gives me an idea about China. He says there are a lot of people that like to be there in China. They like the way of living, the way of they treat traditions and the food and whatever, and there is a stability that in Germany, in France, it's everything is falling apart. People are afraid of democracy a little bit.
Democracy, and I say this as, look, if you were to ask me, hey, would you rather wake up tomorrow reincarnated as a kid in the United States or Germany or China, which would you choose? I'd choose Germany. But
yeah,
China would not be high on my list, truthfully. Having lived in both. But the reasons aren't government. In that case, the reasons are like the brutal competition and competitiveness of youth, and the difficulty of standing out there versus in a place like the United States or Germany, where competition is significant, but nowhere near what you have in the project of childhood in China.
A message you also want to get across with your foundation, right? Or your
Absolutely. This people first approach, not to China, but to most places. I'm attracted to places that are kind of chronically misunderstood. I love being in the Middle East, even parts of Latin America, and recognizing that unless you would like your country only to be known by its worst headlines, for us to delay judgment on other countries just looking at their worst headlines and try to get a more nuanced, complete, comprehensive, and again, people first perspective on the place. But yeah, I think this people first approach will lead to a much saner view of the world and more palatable and kinder for many of us.
Okay, Dax, thank you very much. Have a good time in Mexico, which is also suffering a lot of stereotypes. No, with narcos. So yeah, let's hope for a real deeper understanding. And the young people, they have to read a little bit more and to talk a little bit more than just in Instagram and all this stuff. That's another challenge for us. Okay,
it's
thank
a
you
pleasure,
very much.
Stephanie. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Ciao.
Take care.